Welcome back to another Kira Studios video. I'm Carolyn, and today I want to talk to you about how to use last week's insights, where we talked about the difference between sketching and composing, in what's called a thumbnail sketch. A thumbnail sketch is a small drawing, usually no bigger than about this size, where you make compositional choices. You do not have to include details in those sketches, but what you do have to create is a clear sense for placement, scale, format, and value choices. So let me show you what that looks like in real life. I'm using the paint tube exercise to illustrate how to capture your ideas when you're doing a thumbnail sketch. I begin by looking at my setup and just noting down the shape of the subject matter. And as I do so, I start to ask myself, what is the essence of this subject? And I've boiled it down to this kind of C shape. And then I ask myself, how do I frame it best? Where do I want to place it? And at what scale do I want to place it? Like what box do I put it inside of? And where within the box do I put it? And at this point, I don't have a good idea yet where I'm going, so I'm just going with my first hunch. So a good way to start is just to divide your box into thirds, and where those two lines intersect with each other, those are great places to put your main elements. So it's called the rule of thirds. You're dividing your box into thirds, and wherever those grid lines intersect, it's a great balanced placement position for a harmonious start. I really like the idea of thinking about composition as an adventure, where in the beginning I don't quite know where I'm going, but with every choice I make, I have new possibilities opening up to me. And when I embrace it as that, it becomes really, really fun. So here you see me starting to think about value groups. Which areas in the composition do I want to have dark? Which areas do I want to have light? And a good rule of thumb for clarity is you bring clarity by playing light shapes against dark shapes. So I have the upright tube light against the dark background, the laying down tube darker against a lighter ground. And when you can flip it from light against dark on the top of the composition to dark against light at the bottom, that's called counterchange. It's a very useful compositional device. Now, of course, if your goal isn't that the viewer has a clear viewing experience, if you want it to be a more difficult viewing experience, then you wouldn't seek out creating contrast like this. And you'd go more for obfuscated edges that are a little bit blurry and it's dark against dark. So right now I'm thinking about, where do I want to put focus? And I want to put focus in the area of the tube top. That's where I add more specific shapes, and that's where I'll add contrast. So to bring attention, you need specific shapes, contrast, and clear edges. Now this is where the fun begins, because I'm starting to think about the story that I'm starting to get from this setup. And I'm asking myself, how can I make that small tube feel like it's trapped? So I'm bringing its shape down to be trapped by the ground plane. I'm asking myself, how can I make the white tube to feel more like it's looming above the other one, so I'm making it taller. So I'm starting to deviate from what I see, and I start to compose. I bring it out more so the way I want it to look rather than the way I just see it. And as I play with this, I now start to think about, to play this up even more, what would it need? How can I get that feeling of it being, that small one being trapped, the tall one being looming? How can I increase that? And that's when I start to think about creating a new frame. How about if I crop in, make it a vertical? So my vertical frame reinforces the verticality of that standing paint tube. So I begin with a new frame and place that essence within that frame, coming back, what's the essence of this setup? It's a downward swoop landing on this little C. And now I'm playing with another element, meaning that back edge of the table. What about if I change that to a diagonal? Now there are two types of diagonals in composition. There is the Baroque diagonal that goes from the bottom left to the top right. This is usually perceived as a positive. And then there's the sinister diagonal, which goes from the top left to the bottom right, and we usually perceive this as negative. So I'm choosing a negative, a sinister diagonal, and I'm flipping the value grouping, making the tall looming tube dark, and then that curled up lying down tube light. And so like that, I'm ascribing a new feeling. So see how that worked out? Dark and looming against almost this little curled up infant with a sinister diagonal. So at this point, I'm getting very excited about the story that I have going on in my head, and I'm curious, can I change it? Can I change it from the standing one being dark and towering and looming, and can I make that one into the savior, the hero, the one that saves the curled up tube? And I will try to do that by flipping the diagonal and by assigning a different value grouping to everything. So I'm getting my shapes laid in. And as I do that, I make sure I retain the important specifics of each shape. So with the laying down one, for example, I really liked how there are the creases from it being curled up. And so that was, for me, part of the story. So I'm making sure that as I lay in my third version, I retain all those specifics that I thought were important. Now I'm laying in that Baroque diagonal, that upward one, and I'm flipping the value. Now my laying down tube is going to be dark against a lighter surface. And then the standing one is going to be light against dark. Now, the thing I want to highlight one more time at this point is that I often don't know where I'm going with my compositions, and I let the process guide me, and I like that back and forth. Now, there are other artists who often begin their drawings with a very clear idea of where they're heading, and so they will immediately drive their composition to what they have in mind. So for me, I began with that first assessment thumbnail, and then I drove the story one way or another. But again, you go with what works for you. So here you see me carving out some specifics at the openings of the paint tubes, pushing some contrast. Again, where you bring contrast, that's where the viewer's attention will go first. Oh, notice also how I let that tip, the end of the laying down paint tube, I let that peak above the edge of the tabletop in this one, so it's not so trapped in the ground plane. As I'm bringing the shadow into the upright paint tube, I make sure that I keep it grouped with the light value. And now I'm asking myself, how much of that ground plane do I really need? How can I bring the attention to that center of action? I'm going to crop it off a little bit, bring a little tonal transition there, just so that the viewer's eye doesn't slip down out of the frame, making that hero tube a little bit bigger, working on its specifics, and thinking, okay, we were beginning the journey at that light end of that tube. We glide down to where the two tubes meet. That's where the center of interest is. So I hope this shows you that using thumbnails is really the perfect way to be clear about your ideas in your drawings. Whether you begin vague and then make it clear and clear, or if you begin with a very clear idea, that's up to you. But using these thumbnails that are quick, where you can make choices on a small scale, is an invaluable tool for any artist who wants to be clear with their ideas when they draw. In my own example, I had fun coming up with a story about the dark, menacing tube hovering imposingly over the light tube, and changed it then later to the light savior tube taking care of the mangled body of the laying down tube. Either way, I hope this helps you see how you can become more clear in capturing your ideas, and I can't wait to see what you do. I'll see you next time.